In the shadows of ancient Jerusalem, there exists a collection of texts so controversial that for centuries they were whispered about only in locked rooms. These are not the writings you were taught in Sunday school. These are the forbidden commentaries, the sealed passages, the rabbinic accounts that religious authorities prayed you would never discover. Have you ever wondered what those who lived closest to the time of Jesus actually wrote about him? Long before Christianity spread across empires, before councils decided which gospels were sacred and which were heresy, Jewish scholars were recording something else entirely. In the dim corners of Babylonian academies, in the hidden scriptoriums of Judea, rabbis were compiling the Talmud, a massive, sprawling collection of debates, laws, stories, and secrets. And buried within its thousands of pages are passages about a man they refused to name directly, a man whose very mention could bring persecution, a man they called by code names, by riddles, by fragments that only the initiated could understand. The passages were obscured for a reason. When Christianity became the religion of Roman emperors, when the church gained the power to burn books and silence voices, these Jewish texts became dangerous. Possessing them could mean exile. Reading them aloud could mean death. And so they were hidden, encoded, their most explosive revelations concealed beneath layers of Aramaic wordplay and scribal misdirection. But they survived. In the Talmud, Jesus is never called by his true name. Instead, he appears as Yeshu, a deliberate distortion, a linguistic curse. The rabbis who wrote these passages were not neutral historians. They were men who had seen their temple destroyed, their people scattered, their traditions blamed for rejecting the Messiah that Rome now worshipped. Their words carry the weight of that wound. One passage describes a man who practiced sorcery in Egypt, who learned forbidden arts and returned to lead Israel astray. According to this text, he was not divine. He was a magician, a student of dark knowledge, someone who smuggled occult symbols beneath his skin to bypass sacred wards. The text does not celebrate him. It condemns him as a deceiver who seduced the people with illusions. Another passage speaks of his death, but not the death you know. Here, he is not crucified under Pontius Pilate as an innocent martyr. He is stoned by a Jewish court for blasphemy and idolatry, his body hung on a tree afterward as a warning. The rabbis who recorded this were adamant. This was not a sacrifice for humanity's sins. This was an execution for crimes against heaven. Then there are the texts that were deemed too dangerous even for the Talmud. In medieval Europe, Christian censors scoured Jewish writings, burning any page that mentioned Jesus in ways that contradicted church doctrine. Entire sections were ripped out, inked over, lost to flames. But a few fragments survived, smuggled across borders, copied in secret, preserved by communities who remembered what the world tried to erase. One such fragment describes a confrontation in the afterlife. In this vision, Jesus is not seated at the right hand of God. He is punished in the depths of Gehenna, boiling in excrement for leading souls away from the covenant. The image is grotesque, visceral, deliberately shocking. It was meant to repel Jewish children from converting, to remind them of the cost of abandoning their ancestors' faith. But there is something deeper here, something the censors feared more than blasphemy. These texts reveal a war. Not a war of armies, but a war of narratives. Two communities, both claiming to be the true inheritors of Abraham, both insisting their version of events was sacred, both writing their enemy into damnation. The Christians had their Gospels, their triumphant resurrection, their promise of salvation. The Jews had their Talmud, their warnings, their refusal to forget. And between them, buried in the silence, was the figure of a man whose real story may never be fully known. The rabbis did not write history as we understand it. They wrote theology, law, memory, warning. Their accounts are not meant to be read as journalism. They are encoded resistance. a way of preserving identity in the face of an empire that demanded assimilation or death. Every strange detail, every harsh condemnation, every cryptic name is a refusal to surrender the past. But here is what makes these texts so haunting. They are not simply angry polemics. In some passages, buried beneath the condemnation, there is something else, a recognition, an acknowledgement that this man, whatever else he was, changed the world. That his words, his movement, his death sent shockwaves that would never fade. The rabbis did not write about him because he was insignificant. They wrote about him because he was dangerous. And they were right. The books that contain these passages still exist. They sit in libraries, in private collections, in locked archives where few are allowed to enter. Scholars debate them, sanitize them, argue over translations. But the raw power of the original words remains untouched. These are not the stories you were told. These are the stories someone tried very hard to keep from you. If you want to know what else was hidden in the margins of history, follow us. The church knew about these texts long before you did. In the 13th century, a Dominican friar named Nicholas Donin stood before Pope Gregory IX and presented a list of charges. 35 accusations against the Talmud, each one more damning than the last. He claimed the Jewish texts contained heresies, insults against Christianity, and blasphemies against Jesus that could not be tolerated. Donin was a convert, a former Jew who had turned against his own people, and he knew exactly where the forbidden passages were hidden. The Pope listened, and then he acted. In 1242, cartloads of Jewish manuscripts were dragged into the streets of Paris. Thousands of volumes, copied by hand over generations, containing centuries of accumulated wisdom, debate, and commentary. They were piled in the center of the Place de Grève and set ablaze. The fire burned for an entire day. Witnesses said the smoke could be seen for miles, a dark column rising above the city like a monument to erasure. 24 cartloads of the Talmud turned to ash. Jewish communities across France mourned as if their children had died. But the burnings did not stop there. Over the next 3 centuries, the Talmud was put on trial again and again. In Barcelona, in Rome, in cities across Europe, church authorities convened tribunals to examine the Jewish texts. Rabbis were forced to defend their sacred writings before panels of monks and inquisitors who had already decided the verdict. The accusations were always the same. The Talmud mocked Jesus. It taught Jews to hate Christians. It contained secrets that undermined the very foundations of the faith. Some of the charges were true, others were twisted, mistranslated, taken out of context. But the church did not care about context, it cared about control. What terrified the authorities most was not the insults, it was the existence of an alternative narrative. Christianity had spent centuries constructing a unified story, a seamless account of divine intervention, prophecy fulfilled, salvation offered and rejected. The Jewish texts threatened that story. They suggested that the events Christians considered sacred were viewed very differently by those who had actually been there. They preserved a memory that contradicted the official version. And memory is the most dangerous weapon against empire. So the censors went to work. Jewish printers were ordered to submit their books for inspection before publication. Any passage deemed offensive was to be removed. Entire pages were blacked out. Sections were rewritten. Code words were invented to replace the names that could not be spoken. Where the Talmud once named Yeshu directly, it now spoke of a certain person or that man, or simply left blank spaces where the condemned text had been. But the Jews were not passive victims. They fought back with the only weapons they had, memory and ink. In secret rooms, scribes continued to copy the uncensored versions. They hid them in attics, in cellars, in the hollowed-out spines of other books. They memorized the forbidden passages and passed them down orally, teacher to student, generation to generation. And when the censors came, When the inquisitors demanded to see their manuscripts, they produced the sanitized versions, the cleaned-up texts that had been approved for Christian eyes. The real Talmud, the uncut version, survived underground. In the 18th century, a scholar named Johann Christoph Wagenseil published a collection titled Tela Ignea Satanae, the fiery darts of Satan. It was an expose, a deliberate attempt to reveal what the Jews had been hiding. Wagenseil printed the censored passages in full, in Hebrew and Latin, so that Christians could see for themselves what the Talmud really said about Jesus. He believed he was performing a service, unmasking a conspiracy. What he actually did was preserve evidence that the church had tried to destroy. Because of Wagenseil, because of the censors' obsessive documentation of every blasphemy they found, we now have access to passages that might otherwise have been lost forever. The very act of condemning these texts ensured their survival. The forbidden words were copied into church records, archived in Vatican libraries, catalogued by the same institutions that sought to suppress them. Irony has a way of writing history. But here is what none of the burnings, none of the trials, none of the censorship could erase: the question at the heart of it all. If these texts were merely lies, merely slander from a defeated people, why did the church fight so hard to destroy them? Why convene councils? Why mobilize armies of censors? Why spend centuries hunting down every copy if the words contained no truth? The church's actions reveal what its theology cannot admit. These texts were dangerous, not because they were false, but because they offered a competing truth. They were written by people who lived in the same world as the early Christians, who knew the same streets, spoke the same languages, prayed in the same temples. Their testimony could not be easily dismissed. It had to be actively, violently suppressed. And even then, it survived. Today, scholars debate these passages with careful, sanitized language. They speak of polemical literature and interfaith dialogue. They frame the conflict as a historical misunderstanding, a tragic clash of cultures that can now be reconciled through mutual respect and academic distance. But the texts themselves do not speak in careful language. They speak in fire and condemnation, in blood and accusation, in the raw voice of communities that watch their world burn and refuse to forget. You were never supposed to read these words. The rabbis who wrote them intended them for their own students, their own communities, their own moment in history. The church that censored them intended them for no one, for the flames, for oblivion. But history does not obey intentions. The forbidden has a way of surfacing. The buried rises. The silenced speak. And now you know what they tried to hide. The gods didn't want you to read this. But now it's too late.